Welcome back to the Craftsmen Online podcast. This is a weekly half-hour program focused on the relevant topics in Freemasonry and the various aspects of the craft. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, Editor-in-Chief for Craftsmen Online, and welcoming him back to the podcast. I'd say first time, long time to our guest today, worshipful brother Milosz Jeziorski. He's also known as MJ Dorian from the Creative Codex podcast. I say welcome back because we had a little technical snafu in the first run of the podcast. So welcome back, brother.
Thank you, brother. It's a pleasure and an honor, just as much as it was the first time and anytime. I'll do it the third time. Let's do it.
Oh, no, I'm hoping we get this one solid. Brother Jeziorski is the worshipful master of Compact Lodge number 402 of the 4th Manhattan District in New York. And he's on for a topic that, man, I love talking about this. I think every Freemason gets into it. It's ritual, but mainly we're going to start getting into some of the origins of ritual. And every brother knows, Freemasonry is one of the most commonly misunderstood institutions in Western culture. A lot of this is partially by design. Our rituals closely wrapped in a long-held tradition of secrecy. And as we start to go through the degrees, all of us start asking tons of questions, and some of us do it out loud. And that's where I'd like to start, Brother Milosz, is what inspired you to pursue this exploration of getting to the origins of Freemasonry?
In terms of my own journey, it started roughly 8 years ago when I was initiated, and then shortly thereafter, passed and then raised to the third degree of Master Mason. So somewhere around that point, you start to think that that's all there is. And then you become part of the lodge and you feel like, well, that's a certain chapter that closed now that you've gotten those 3 degrees in the Blue Lodge. But progressively, as you start to participate in the degrees through being an officer or just having some speaking roles and such, you start to notice that that's more of what it actually is about, right? The participating, the being engaged through ritual and such. And so in one of these moments, I distinctly remember I was engaged in just being a minor officer and maybe having a part. And then there was kind of a moment where I wasn't doing anything. I was just watching the ritual taking place. And this moment hit me where I was just looking and I see this well-furnished room and these other gentlemen, well-dressed and going through their parts. And of course, a candidate or two. And then I just had a moment where I said, what is this? It just hit me like, wait a second. Like I just went through all those degrees as well. And now I'm just on the other end. I'm like, what is this? This feels profound. This feels timeless. And that it feels, like an awe-inspiring feeling kind of like rolls over you in that moment. And so from that moment on, I can't help but investigate what is that, right? It's part of the human experience in a sense, like the ritual itself, but also Freemasonry specifically. There's a very long history that it has, and then there's all these other branching out speculative histories that one can certainly imply that they originate from. So all of that kind of informed my initial fascination and curiosity. I'm sure it was similar for you.
Oh, yeah. When you're a candidate, you have a million questions that are happening, especially the night of your first degree, because you're like, wait, I have to put on this outfit. You told me to come to the lodge in a dark suit and tie, and here I am. And now I have to go into this other room and do this. And then what happens once I get in there? And why am I wearing this blindfold? And what are these sounds? And what are these noises? And what is happening? I can hear people moving around. I can hear metal and sticks and clanging. And what is it? Why are they talking in Old English? What are these? They're asking me questions. Something is going to be significant. Is there a test? Is there there's tons of things that are just going on in your mind. And then finally, I always tell initiates that everything you thought about Freemasonry up until that moment, it's going to change because you're going to have a new chapter of knowledge, and all of those pre-held dispositions you have about that's all going to get pushed to the side because now you're going to focus on in the real life moment. I think the real origins part comes from when you actually begin to participate in the ritual. Once you get involved with a degree team or have a part in the ritual, you're reading the standard work and lecture, our little blue book here in the New York jurisdiction, and you're learning those words more than one way, more than just memorizing it. But now you're going through those words and saying, the original hands of history that took these thoughts and put them to paper with pen. What were they thinking? What was the inspiration?
In our day-to-day life, we don't really, unless you're like involved in some kind of traditions that have it, we don't think we're doing ritual. But a birthday celebration, a graduation, a funeral, those are all rituals. And those go back longer than we can count and track. So if we're talking about ritual, it's just good to also have everyone, common listeners and Masons together, agree that part of what a definition of ritual is this choreographed action, which is meant to convey deep meaning and elicit transformation. And that part, elicit transformation, is actually really integral and includes birthdays, graduations, funerals, right? And so when we participate in these kinds of events and also rituals in traditions like Masonry, those are certainly the goals, and there's just nothing strange about that. It's actually kind of awe-inspiring to see it take place when it's done well, right?
But now that it's wrapped in secrecy, as we shared, you have two thoughts that kind of come when you hear the word ritual. Either we're all going to get around in a circle and something out of this world is going to be worshipped and it's going to be bad. Or you think of the Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman, Eyes Wide Shut movie where there's about to be some really freaky stuff that's going on here.
I love those movies too. Yeah, you got to love them. How could you not love those movies? Everybody wants to assume some kind of like crazy thing is happening, right? I mean, it makes for a good movie.
But it makes it very difficult when, coworkers or friends say, hey, what do you got going on at Lodge? Oh, yeah, I got to study my ritual. You're what?
Boy, that's a whole other conversation. I have family members that they send me stuff. They send me like a text like about, this is what Masonry is doing or whatever. I'm like, I've been a Mason for 8 years. I know what Masonry is doing. You don't have to tell me these conspiracy theories. But yeah, another conversation.
Yeah. So we all kind of start at the same place as far as, being Freemasons, and you're thrust into ritual because you are actually the central figure in much of the degree work going through the first 3 degrees of Freemasonry. And then you start to do the exploration. As we mentioned, you evolve out of being a candidate and you become someone who's administering the ritual. So when did you start making the connections as far as evidence? Because one of the things that I found very compelling in the presentation you gave at the Livingston Library was, the discovery of ritual in a mysterious cave in, of all places, France. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So the connection with the ancient, really far ancient caves came from something completely un-Masonic and unesoteric, which was part of my podcast called Creative Codex, CODEX. And the whole point of this show and exploration is tracing the history of creativity through various creative geniuses in time. And I wanted to find the origin of art, specifically creativity, where we can say it basically blossomed forth in human culture. And I ended up taking that journey all the way back to cave paintings. And in the process of investigating one of these called Chauvet Cave in southern France, that's Chauvet cave, there's this enormous cave structures, underground structure. And aside from these indications of art that are made on the wall, in one chamber of the cave, there's what can only be described as an altar. It's the closest thing you can imagine to a cubic stone that 40,000 years ago humans would be able to make or use. And perched right on top of the corner of that stone is a cave bear skull. And the cave bear skull specifically positioned so it's facing the entrance to that chamber of the cave. And when they showed this in one of the documentaries, and you can see pictures of this online, and there's this thing has been frozen in time to 40,000 years ago when someone placed this thing and they used it in some fashion because there was also ash next to it, some kind of incense or possibly burned. And I couldn't help but immediately associate that with Freemasonry, us gathering also in a room that's very akin to a cave, right? No windows, an altar in the center, things placed on the altar. In some jurisdictions or countries, there might be also ash or incense burnt. And it just goes really far back. How do you explain that? That was before written language, that was that meaningful for early human ancestors to do.
I think a lot of brothers start down this path because we're all trying to figure out the large question of like, where did Freemasonry come from? What are the origins of Freemasonry? And unlocking that answer, part of it would be if we could get a clearer picture on the ritual. And what's fascinating is, also in your presentation, you take us on, not only a trip through time with the history of man, but also through the different cultures. And you start to see how Freemasonry is really now a modern collection pot of some of the wise rites of passages that were bestowed to men and some women, as we'll talk about, throughout time. And that's what really started popping my mind, because you were laying out your evidence and I'm sitting here going, Freemasonry ritual didn't just come from one body or one time period. It is a collection from the beginning of time, and we'll just never really know. Tell me about the ancient ceremonies in Greece, because when you made this connection, a light bulb just went ding.
Right. So the Eleusinian Mysteries, it's part of this really rich and long-standing tradition in ancient Greek culture. And these things can be traced back at least to 1600 BC to 392 AD. So at least we can say that for a period of 2,000 years, this tradition was taking place in a town called Eleusis, which is near Athens. And everyone who was anyone wanted in on this thing, and it would happen twice a year. The lesser mysteries, as they were called, would happen in the springtime, and then the greater mysteries would happen in the fall. If you wanted in on the greater mysteries, which was really the big one that everyone wanted to experience, you first had to pass through the lesser mysteries. You wouldn't qualify otherwise. And with that said, anybody can do it, from men, women, and in some cases even children and slaves. This was an integral part of the life of ancient Greece. The crazy thing is, everyone who participated was sworn to secrecy upon the penalty. There it is. Upon the penalty of death. And this wasn't a figurative death. There's actual documents of trials that happened against people who perhaps revealed too much or shared with their experiences in some fashion. So this was pretty literal, and there was really a penalty to it. And we know that it was highly ritualistic. There was definitely the theme of death and rebirth as a main element. It was based on the wonderful story of Persephone and Demeter, the myth that is possibly even Proto-Greek, that exists before many of the celebrated myths that we understand are from. So part of this ritual was a procession in the greater mysteries that would lead into one of these cavern spaces. And this cavern still exists in Eleusis. So there's a lot of these things that we can confirm, but the actual things that happened, only very few things we can confirm because people were so good at keeping this secret. So there was the procession into the cave with all of the candidates. Again, we see the symbol of the cave, laudrum, right, used. And the candidate was then disrobed. They were given an animal skin and also given something to drink, which is also part of the mystery that we're not sure what that was about. So the theme of death and rebirth was an important element of it. The curious kind of overlap with one symbol in Masonry we see that's not really talked about is the pomegranate, which you see decorating the tops of the two pillars near the inner door. And the pomegranate is a symbol of Persephone. And it was very important and integral to that story and to the journey into the underworld. So really curious echo there. And of course, upon completion of the greater mysteries, the candidate who was now considered having reached through that point of transformation was given a consecrated robe, a white consecrated robe. And the philosopher Cicero was famously quoted as saying that the mysteries not only taught men how to live, but how to die.
Just to replay from the beginning, the first would be in the Masonic Ritual, there is the winter and summer solstice, which are held in veneration with Freemasons, with the Holy Saints John. So there's a tie-in there. We also have a thing for aprons, as you may have picked up, which tend to be white and either made of lambskin or they're white leather aprons. So there's a connection there. The two big variances, well, three actually. One is that I can say that for our degrees, no one takes anything. The other thing, unfortunately, is our secrets. We're not so great with that. I find it interesting that, for 2,000 years that this Greek ceremony has been, you're like, we don't know anything about it, when you can go on Amazon and order, books about Masonic ritual that, may have some accuracy, may not, we can't really confirm or deny any of those parts, but we weren't the best for being known to keep secrets. That part we kind of let out a little bit over the years. So that was unfortunate.
They didn't have the internet. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the other part of the ceremony that you had talked about. There were penalties if they revealed the secrets.
It was very literal. Like people would be put on trial, like in public, or in a public court rather. And there was one person where it's documented. The charge was for distribution of the Eleusinian mysteries at a dinner that he was holding. Yeah.
But they didn't get into what he said. See, that would have been a clue right there.
Oh, no.
Then another massive difference is that, men and women were able to participate in this ceremony. And for now, at least in our jurisdiction, Freemasonry is strictly a fraternity for men. Do you know of any famous women or notable women of that time that would have gone through that or been traced to that? Because I'm just wondering if this was something that was open for just all everyday average people or reserved purely for those that were deemed worthy, like nobles.
So as far as the Eleusinian mysteries go, this was an integral part of culture of the time in ancient Greece. So everyone from philosophers to, like I was saying, just peasants to farm, people who owned farms, and every rung of society, no matter what, was allowed into it. But there were other mystery school traditions like the Pythagoreans where it's more exclusive and it's more based on whether you are able to prove your intellect, whether you're able to prove your worth in a sense,
Let's talk about our boy Pythagoras, because he was truly a world traveler. I mean, he collected so much knowledge from some of the foundation cultures from around the world at such a pivotal time and brought it back home. And I didn't know this part about him. I just knew him as the Pythagorean theorem and the advances that he made in logic and mathematics. What did he add to the origin ritual?
What's really fascinating about Pythagoras is that he was just this eminently distinguished character in ancient Greek culture. And he's considered the first philosopher. And in fact, he even coined the term philosopher. So how much more of a first philosopher could he be, right? And the distinction there is he didn't want himself to be considered a sage. So this wasn't like a cult the way we might think of one, because he eventually built up a school of followers. He didn't want to be considered a sage, and that was the term at the time. So he invented philosopher. And then he says that it's the difference between those who know, which are sages, they assume and they present this all-knowing sense, versus those who are attempting to know. So as a philosopher, he's putting forth an attempt, a virtuous attempt. So he started this school after amassing the philosophies and knowledge of the ancient Greeks, the Eleusinian mysteries, and traveling to Egypt and Syria and Babylon and even ancient India. And there's some odd records also that perhaps this might be true more than just, myth that show a figure traveling into those places. And he established the school, which was based on basically a 3-degree system where you have the novice, the disciple, and the adept. And once you're the adept, then you're kind of officially in and considered an equal. But during those first 2 stages, you're tested in various ways, physically, mentally. You go through trials. And one of these trials includes surviving a night alone in a pitch black cavern. I can't escape this cavern symbol. And the cavern is said to have been haunted by the ghosts of failed candidates. Then another trial involved being locked in a cell for a week with only a crust of bread and a pitcher of water. And you're also given symbols to meditate on and reflect on. And then by the end of that week, you're supposed to share all the insights, you've gained from reflecting on these things. And then one other fascinating detail is when you transition from being a novice to a disciple, you were then granted the sacred word and the Pythagorean science of numbers. So there was there's a lot of knowledge that was, bestowed upon you for being able to get through those degrees.
Do we have any record or clues as to what was going through that ritual, or is it kind of lost like the Eleusinian mysteries?
Right. So we just have those elements of those details. We know a lot about the Pythagoreans otherwise, their beliefs. We have his writings as told by his students and written down. We know that once you were an adept, past that third degree and accepted into the school, that you had to become a vegetarian. Everyone in there was vegetarian. And for 600 BC, that's pretty forward thinking. And at the same time, women were considered equals, especially if it was a man's wife, which was also very forward thinking for the time. And of course, women were allowed in as well, but everyone had to prove themselves through those initial trials.
It's also interesting too, in both of these examples, and just relating to Freemasonry as the third example, the number 3, as far as the amount of degrees that kind of symbolize like a birth, middle age, and then, death. And but the other thing that was kind of different is that the Pythagorean ceremony, it seems to be an individual experience, where in Freemasonry, there's brothers around you in the room as part of the ritual team, that yes, you're going through it as a candidate or a brother or the initiate, but there's others around. It's not like we're sending you into the woods with the wolves, so to speak. So I found that interesting. And the Eleusinian mysteries, I guess we never really know how they were conducted, and probably the people that undertook it wouldn't remember anyways, especially if they had that fancy drink that kind of knocked them out beforehand. So that's a great way of keeping it secret. That's a pro tip right there.
Well, it does seem like it was a communal experience, the Eleusinian mysteries, because it was definitely about building the sense of community and brotherhood / familial quality with the other human beings, around you. So that part, I do think was more of a group, maybe more akin to a Freemason ritual, versus the Pythagorean ones were very much about, you're right, about the individual, which is interesting distinction.
Just to kind of bring it back home and get to where we started out with, now that you've expanded your knowledge base with all this work, how have your thoughts shifted at all when it comes to sitting in the chair and being a part of the ritual that we do in Freemasonry? Do you now have a bigger perspective of things? If you do, what is it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Over the last few years, especially as I entered into the East and master of the lodge for the last 3 years, but in the process of going through the various officer chairs and everything and participating in these degrees, there were such enriching experiences to my personal being, my unconscious kind of sense of the world and of myself, that the thing that really fascinates me to this day, and what I'm really all about right now, and sharing these experiences with other brothers and helping them, is that there's a real practical world application of these things. It's not just, we're not just all like floating out in the ether with our thoughts and theories and esoteric mumbo jumbo. Like, all of these things have a very practical, real world application, and that's what really keeps me going and keeps me respecting this ancient and beautiful tradition. Is really that, because I see its effects. I see the positive effects of it in my life and in the lives of the other brothers and in friends that I've introduced to it. And that's the beauty of it to me.
It's interesting you hit on that point, because, I think, personally and professionally, I've seen that as well. When it comes to leadership roles at work or within teams or in meetings, I would venture to say if I was around other Freemasons, I think I would be able to notice that they were Freemasons and the words that they chose and how they would structure the flow of a meeting, almost like with an agenda, and the way that they would comment. I think that you would be able to pick up on that. But definitely personally, like, I had a friend whose daughter recently, went through her communion at church, and I thought of one of our lines of ritual when it comes to, finding light in life and continuing to seek that goodness, and kind of paraphrase that a little bit, but would have never had those thoughts had I not gone through this ritual. So as we kind of bring it home with those origins of ritual, that's the whole thing. Those rites of passage, that wisdom, it has been passed down. Whether it came from caves in France or really smart guys in Greece, or if it just came from, our friends and brothers in our neighborhood who are also lodge members, it got to where it needed to be.
Yeah. No, that's the profound thing that still startles me, is that it's not a singular tradition. It's something that the human spirit calls forth, that it's looking for. And maybe some people, maybe they don't dig it, maybe they're not into it, but certainly this thing keeps being reborn in various guises, right? Whether it's Freemasonry or some other tradition we're not even super familiar with, but I think it's the human spirit. It seeks out these kinds of experiences.
This has been the Craftsmen Online Podcast. We're happy to have him back. First time for you, second time for me. Worshipful Brother Milosz Jeziorski, also known as MJ Dorian from the Codex Podcast. Thanks so much for coming back, brother.
It's been an honor. Thank you so much, brother.
Definitely going to do this again.
Yeah, let's rock it.
If Masonic education is important to you, you can sign up for our email newsletter at craftsmenonline.com. A reminder that new episodes are available for download every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.